This training module has been prepared for Pacific High Ambition delegations participating in negotiations at IMO in regard to greenhouse gas emissions reduction. IMO adopted in 2018 an initial strategy to reduce emissions from international ships. The strategy proposes agreement on a basket of measures to be agreed by member states by 2023. Measures are broken down into initial short-term measures, i.e. those that will be given effect prior to 2023, mid-term measures, those to be given effect between 2023 and 2030, and long-term measures, anticipated to be adopted after 2030. Negotiations are currently stalled as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. However, progress to date has been limited and thus far restricted to initial negotiations over proposed short-term measures. The short-term measure debate, in turn, has been restricted to proposed technical and operational goal-based measures. It is generally agreed that the level of transformation required for the sector and the speed at which this is required to occur will require nothing short of an entire energy transformation and is thus an enormous undertaking. Major actions will be required, and it would seem that market-based measures, or MBMs, financial carrots and sticks, are essential to achieve this transformational change. This was certainly the position that IMO arrived at when it last debated the use of MBMs for emissions reduction. In 2009, IMO reported to UNFCCC at COP15 that it considered market-based measures to be an essential component of any strategy for the international shipping sector. However, when this matter was considered at MEPC, the Marine Environment Protection Committee, in 2018, the use of MBMs was considered only as a possible mid-term measure. MBMs were extensively canvassed in IMO between 2007 and 2011 in a fractious and ultimately abandoned debate. It is highly likely that when the debate is reopened, it will be approached with a high degree of caution and is likely to be protracted. Given the urgency of the 1.5 degree centigrade agenda, the Pacific has argued that the negotiations on MBMs should be initiated as quickly as possible, in large part to avoid the situation where the merits of a specific MBM, such as that proposed by the International Chamber of Shipping et al. To MEPC 75, are discussed in isolation and in the absence of agreed definition of or role of MBMs. This presentation covers our initial research on this matter and is intended to inform discussion on positioning of Pacific for the forthcoming MBM debate. The whole issue of the use of financial and market instruments to control emissions is central to the entire climate crisis discourse. The IMO has thus far failed to reach agreement on what MBMs mean for its sector. Three critical questions arise for Pacific delegations. When will IMO formally debate MBMs? What will they debate? And who will debate? All three questions are complex, and there currently are no clear answers. This, and the related issue of the level of ambition, will be the two most critical and contentious issues to be agreed prior to the adoption of the revised strategy in 2023. The results that IMO come up with will have much wider ramifications across the global climate change debate than just shipping, so it is critically important that Pacific delegations fully understand the context of this discussion. In answering the first question, when will IMO formally debate MBMs? Under its current timetable, this is unlikely to happen until the debate on short-term measures is resolved. It could be possibly delayed by up to 2 years. The proposal by ICS et al. To MEPC 75, however, to introduce a mandatory $2 a tonne fuel levy to fund industry R&D under a proposed International Maritime Research Board allows an earlier opportunity to advance the debate on MBMs, possibly later this year. So, why do we recommend seeking every opportunity to encourage IMO to negotiate MBMs? Firstly, IMO is a member of the UN family, albeit a specialised agency, and as such would be assumed to act at least consistently with the highest level of UN global policy. At COP25, the UN Secretary-General recalled that the Paris Agreement was a solemn promise and advised that a price on carbon is vital if we are to have any chance of delivering on that promise. Members were directed to make progress on carbon pricing and to shift taxation from income to carbon. The Secretary-General noted that it was essential to ensure the transition to a green economy is a just transition, and concluded that without the full engagement of the big emitters, all our efforts will be completely undermined. The UN Secretary-General and other UN agencies such as UNFCCC have also consistently noted the urgency and upscaling of direct action required to ensure a 1.5 degrees C agenda. Multiple science, including the pre-COVID-19 released IPCC 1.5 degree special report, has already doubled down on the directive to act with urgency and ambition. The pandemic only compresses the timeframes for taking action. Numerous reports published recently conclude that without immediate and significant action, a 1.5 degree upper limit global warming is unlikely to be achieved. It is clear at science that the IMO's current level of ambition must be substantively increased in the revised strategy due in 2023. The amount shipping needs to reduce is much higher than the current targets, and the urgency is paramount. We cannot see how this can be achieved without using strong financial instruments. The second question, what will IMO debate, is also a wide open question. Last time IMO could not even agree which MBMs were preferred, considering 10 different proposals and convening a specialist task force. Research since suggests that a carbon tax or levy is likely the most efficient and most cost-effective measure. The only fully fledged proposal this time around is the $2 a tonne R&D subsidy being proposed by ICS et al. At the other end of the scale, current research indicates that investments of over $1 trillion being needed by 2030. To provide guidance on tackling this complex and contentious subject, the initial strategy has provided guiding principles for delegations to be cognizant of. We discuss these in some detail in later slides. In answering the third question, who will debate, the current structure of the IMO and the participation of members in these negotiations to date strongly indicate that small island developing states and least developed countries in particular will be underrepresented. This, of course, raises large questions around equity. The need to maintain the level playing field is consistently heard in the IMO. Whilst this might hold true in terms of commercial competition and the World Trade Organization rules, the question of whether a political level playing field exists, given the IMO's UN mandate, needs to be examined. We look at this in more detail further in this presentation. It is a current requirement that any measures proposed are accompanied by an assessment of the impact on states of the measure. Most commentators agree that should measures create a negative impact, this is highly likely to be disproportionately so for small island developing states and least developed countries. Market-based measures potentially could affect the fuel cost of shipping by several hundreds of dollars per tonne and thus have considerable impact on transport costs. MBMs also have the potential to raise tens of hundreds of billions of dollars in revenue. Since the requirements on impact assessment were agreed in the initial strategy, the impact assessment procedure has been shown to be problematic, especially in regard to the issue of impacts on small island developing states. Tonga has proactively offered a workaround solution to this in the short term. However, we consider it would be highly advantageous to restate a specific position on the impacts on our SIDS and LDCs in advance of the MBM debate. The initial strategy includes the need to consider the impacts of measures on states, in particular LDCs and SIDS. We argue that there is a four-step hierarchy of potential impacts. The first is the impact if the industry does not play its full role in a 1.5-degree agenda. For the climate most vulnerable, exceeding 1.5 degrees is an existential risk. At the second level of impact, regardless of whether shipping stays within a 1.5-degree pathway from now on, shipping emissions today already result in loss and damage to Pacific small island developing states. If market-based measures result in any negative impact on either transport cost or transport security, this impact on SIDS and LDCs needs to be compensated for. This aspect of revenue allocation has not been adequately considered in previous negotiations. All modelling to date assumes that transport cost can be used as a proxy for ascertaining the level of impact. However, we argue that transport security, that is, the ongoing provision of adequate levels of connectivity for importation of essential goods, is critical for societal survival and well-being. As most Pacific states operate outside the norms of the global market economy, transport security is arguably of higher priority than transport cost, especially in relation to food and health security and disaster response capability. The initial strategy commits delegations to being guided by a number of principles. It divides these principles into two groups. Firstly, those enshrined in instruments already developed, and then 4 other principles. In terms of the enshrined instrument, it agrees to be guided by those in both IMO instruments and other UN-recognised climate instruments. The principles of non-discrimination, no more favourable treatment, and common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities are named as examples. Other relevant principles in this category include the principle of polluter pays, well recognised by IMO already in the IOPC Fund, the OPRC, and HNS conventions. The principle of highest possible ambition is of course enshrined in the 2015 Paris Agreement. The other principles are the requirement that the strategy applies to all ships regardless of flag, the need to consider the impact on states, and the need for evidence-based decision-making balanced with a precautionary approach. Unfortunately, no guidance is offered as to how these potentially conflicting principles are to be balanced or prioritised. IMO has not thus far considered what the principle of CBDRRC means for this international sector, let alone how it would be balanced against the need for no more favourable treatment to be shown any ship regardless of its flag. For some Pacific states, i.e. those hosting independent registries, the potential conflict of interest is obvious. For example, whilst the principles of polluter pays and highest possible ambition are not specifically mentioned, they are both of high significance to the debate on MBMs. Polluter pays implies that it is the ship that is responsible for paying for the impact of its pollution. Whether this ultimately means the ship charterer, the ship owner, or its flag of state is unclear, but there is definitely an obligation at an industry level for the effects of the pollution to be either avoided, remedied, or mitigated. If a ship creates unacceptable impact by emitting oil to the marine environment, the responsibility for that pollution lies with the ship. There would seem no reason why this should not apply to the emissions of greenhouse gases to air. Therefore, the ship should either stop polluting or pay some form of compensation. The principle of highest possible ambition implies that the most effective and efficient market-based measures should be adopted as early as possible. Thus far, IMO has avoided debate on all these principles in regard to short-term measures. We consider there is an extremely strong case for the Pacific to make that the priority market-based measures should be a carbon tax or levy, where the majority of revenue raised, potentially tens to hundreds of billions, should be dedicated to the loss and damage suffered by the climate most vulnerable from the effects of climate change. Of the MBM options available, there are 2 basic choices. The sector continues emitting but pays compensation to other sectors to reduce their emissions, or the alternative is that the sector takes full responsibility for reducing its own emissions. Given the UN Secretary-General's direction that all sectors must take responsibility, we are only considering the latter. So, if we are to have an MBM, then we assume a cost. There are a number of analyses that are saying that the cost will have little impact on global transport costs and in the long term will be positive. This would be a good thing for SIDS and LDCs. In the Pacific, transport costs per capita are extremely high already, but if the costs are negative, then current projections are that the impact will be modest for most scenarios, but will be felt disproportionately by small island developing states. This was recognised during the 2010-13 debate, and there was recognition that the small island developing states would need to be compensated, but no agreement could be reached on what form of compensation mechanism should be used and how this would be administered. A climate levy equally applied by all ships is likely the best option for the international maritime sector. If this is agreed, then there are three primary questions. Should it be a voluntary contribution or a mandatory regulation? Most people agree it must be mandatory to be effective, and we agree with this conclusion. How much tax? UMass and others have calculated several hundreds of dollars per tonne of fuel is needed to drive real industry change. The carbon price needs to follow a defined preset trajectory, providing investors with certainty and therefore incentivizing investments in technical and operational measures. Many commentators suggest that to attract wider support and prevent a shock to the industry, the levy could start at a relatively low level and be raised increasingly so that by 2030 the price will make zero-carbon technologies economically more attractive for new ships, and by 2050 fossil fuel-powered vessels are economically unattractive to operate. However, most analysis shows that the tax needs to be significant to have effect. It is also important to remember that the impact of the levy needs to be considered relative to the other impacts on operational costs. The most important of these is the cost of oil. In the last 10 years, this has fluctuated from below $30 a barrel to over $110 a barrel, with oil in October 2019 at $55 a barrel. Given that the industry has demonstrated its ability to handle large fluctuations in its major operational cost, there appears no obstacle to an initial price of $250 a tonne of fuel oil and revised upwards every 5 years, which is what is going to be required to drive substantive change. This sets a clear market signal that transition is essential and urgent. The third question is, how would it be spent? The industry is saying it should be spent internally within the industry on research and development. A tax set at a level that forces market change potentially would recoup many billions in revenue. SIDS and LDCs can legitimately ask why this should not feed directly into the Climate Adaptation and Resilience Funds, as was identified by IMO in 2009. At a minimum, it should provide for compensation for any disproportionate impact on SIDS and LDCs of decarbonising the industry. Who will make these decisions on what type of MBM is adopted for international shipping, and as importantly, who will get the revenue generated, is the only question we can currently answer with certainty. That decision will be made ideally by consensus, but ultimately by a majority of IMO member states participating in the plenary of the relevant MEPC. The MEPC decision could only be challenged in its ratification at IMO Council. As the graphs show, it is therefore highly likely that the voices of SIDS and LDCs will be underrepresented. Whilst SIDS and LDCs make up 40%, 67 countries out of 174 of IMO member states, they are poorly represented at the Intersessional Working Group and MEPC meetings in regards to greenhouse gas emissions reduction to date. The graphs on the right show that of the IMO members that are SIDS and LDCs, only 15% of them participated in the MEPC Working Group on greenhouse gas compared to 63% of developed country member states and 31% of developing country members. This pattern of underrepresentation is also apparent in MEPC itself, with 40% of SIDS and LDCs members participating compared to 94% of developed country members participating in the last MEPC meeting. And the intersessional working group meetings. Using the 6th intersessional as an example, 18% of SIDS and or LDCs participated, while 69% of developed country members participated and 35% of developing country members. Pacific High Ambition states have made up many of these SIDS and LDCs. In the event that SIDS and LDCs want to challenge the decisions of MEPC, they have only 3 out of 40 representatives, or 7.5%, on Council currently. In this slide, we have a table of the core principles referred to in the strategy. In our analysis, the type of carbon tax we are recommending can be checked positively against each of these principles. If the tax is a universal tax, i.e. applied to all ships without exception, then the principles of non-discrimination, no more favourable treatment, and applying to all ships are met. No ship is treated differently to any other. If a significant portion of the revenue is directed to the Green Climate Fund and thereby made available to the climate vulnerable as a priority for their adaptation and resilience needs, then this goes some way to addressing the principle of CBDRC. Shipping will be paying a punitive tax under the principle of polluter pays for the effects of their emissions, and this in turn is being directed to the needs of those most impacted by that pollution and those least resourced and equipped to respond to these impacts. The issue of impact on states can be addressed in 2 ways. Firstly, the likely increases in international shipping costs for SIDS and LDCs is offset by their greatly improved access to GCF climate financing. Secondly, we need to ensure the portion of the revenue to be spent on incentivising change by subsidising industry R&D of new technology is applied equitably across the fleet, not just directed at the biggest ships carrying the largest cargoes. SIDS and LDCs would be well within their rights to request that a quota or percentage of any RD&D funds be directed specifically at the types of ships servicing our needs. The need for an ambitious MBM is clearly evidence-based. Shipping is not on track to plateau emissions in the near future and then to rapidly decline. The measures IMO is currently considering do not get us there. Further, the decisions on revenue allocation from the tax need to also be evidence-based. For allocation of the compensation for loss and damage, the GCF process is set up to do this in a manner that is mandated, transparent and accountable. The process for allocating the RD&D subsidy under IMO also needs to be set up so that the resourcing decisions are based on latest science and not politically weighted. We are recommending that a tax is levied on all bunker on all international ships. The financial instrument is made of 3 components: a pollution tax, plus an industry RD&D subsidy, plus the administration cost. We start with an initial floor or entry price of $250 per tonne of fuel oil. Different grades of fuel would need to adjust this price to reflect their carbon intensity. The levy would be applied as per the International Chamber of Shipping et al. Proposal by being included in the bunker delivery note from the fuel supplier to the fuel purchaser. The levy is then divided between the compensatory portion, we suggest at least 51%, being paid by the fuel purchaser into an individual ship account held at the Green Climate Fund. If we use the administration cost of GCF at 16% as a proxy, then this leaves 33%, or about $82 per tonne, for subsidising industry RD&D. This would be paid into a second set of individual ship accounts to fund the work of an International Maritime Research Board operating under IMO mandate and with an as yet to be agreed governance structure. There would be administration and running costs for each component and costs to both port and flag state controls for monitoring, reporting and enforcement requirements. This slide shows the allocation of each $100 of revenue generated as a percentage. Conservative estimates are that a levy along the lines of what is recommended here could raise in excess of $60 billion per annum initially. We are strongly recommending that the majority of this is diverted to the needs of the climate most vulnerable. There are many analysts who are contending that any of the revenue that is not spent in sector means delays in how fast shipping can transition, and therefore all the revenue should be spent within the shipping sector. We argue both needs must be met. If revenue is spent inside the sector, that is a subsidy, and it is ironic that shipping has always argued against subsidies, given concerns over market distortion and the desire for a level playing field. A subsidy was not raised to cover the RD&D investment needed by the industry to reduce the incidence of oil spill or ballast water, or high sulfur fuel pollution, for example. And there is increasing evidence that some emission reduction R&D costs are already being considered or invested in by the industry and national sources in developed economies, including pandemic-related relief or stimulus funds. However, it is also clear that driving change at the speed and scale needed is going to require financial incentives, and this is achieved by the 33% allocation to subsidies. We are also proposing that any states who are disproportionately impacted should have priority to access the funds administered by the Green Climate Fund and the International Maritime Research Board as compensation for those disproportionate impacts. International Chamber of Shipping et al. Have already proposed a system for collecting a $2 a tonne tax levied on fuel bunker at the point of supply. In their proposal, each ship will pay its levy into an individual ship account in an International Maritime Research Fund. The research fund would be managed by an independent International Maritime Research Board. In the ICS proposal, weighted in favour of the industry, which in turn takes its direction from an IMO supervisory body, also weighted in favour of industry, that reports regularly to the Marine Environment Protection Committee. The Solomon Islands have submitted a commenting paper that asks for greater direct IMO member state control of the governance and decision making, SIDS and LDC's representation on the governing board, and a quota of funds to be directed to addressing the shipping needs of SIDS and LDCs. ICS et al. Are contending that their proposal isn't an MBM because the size of the levy is so low it doesn't impact the market. This is semantics. It is clearly a mandatory levy on fuel to fund R&D and is therefore a financial instrument. If the changes requested by Solomon Islands are accepted, there should be no barrier in this process being scaled from $2 to $250 per tonne, and an agreed portion being diverted to the Green Climate Fund. The IMO is not the correct UN body to be administering or allocating the portion of funds earmarked for compensation to the climate most vulnerable. The Green Climate Fund is a UN-administered process for receiving and disbursing exactly this type of fund. It is designed to administer multi-billion dollars per annum income streams with transparent and accountable systems already in place. It was established to give practical effect to common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. The GCF has been mandated by the international community, all the same countries who are IMO members. 154 countries are eligible to apply for such funds, so it covers all the countries IMO currently classifies as developing states, SIDS and LDCs. All that would be needed for GCF to receive a portion of the revenue generated by a shipping tax would be for it to establish a system of individual ship accounts that mirrored those under the ICS et al. Proposal, which each ship owner would pay that portion of the tax into.